How does the math of a record deal work? The answer can vary significantly depending on the leverage of the artist and label, but I'm going to go through some math using numbers from an actual recording contract from a popular record label. The contract is from the 21st century. It doesn't seem that this artist was very popular when they signed. This artist signs with the record label and agrees to record an EP. This contract allows the label to potentially ask for the first release to be an album instead of an EP, so for this video I'll assume it's an album. The label also has options for the album to record up to 5 additional albums, so it's potentially a 6-album deal. The artist grants all of their sound recording copyright ownership, aka the masters, to the record label. The artist's base master royalty for streams and sales is 15% for the first 2 albums, 16% for the next 2, and 17% for the next 2. For streams, this royalty is applied to the record label's net receipts. For sales, this royalty is applied to a wholesale price. For sync licensing, the artist would receive 50% of the label's net receipts. There are 3 major caveats. 1, if a music producer or audio engineer receives points on the master, then those points would come out of the artist's share. So if the artist is getting 15% and a producer receives 3 points on the master, then the artist's share drops to 12%. This type of arrangement means that the artist's master royalty is all in. 2, the artist receives a reduced royalty rate for sales outside of the US. For sales in Canada, they receive 90% of their US rate. For Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and much of Europe, they receive 80% of their US rate. And for other countries, they receive 66 and 2/3 of their US rate. 3, if records are sold at a significant wholesale discount, then the artist's royalty rate would be reduced. So not only would the record be sold at a lower price, the artist would also get a lower percentage of it. Records sold at or near the full wholesale price are considered top line. For midline records, they get 75% of their full rate. For budget records, they get 50% of their full rate. For records sold lower than budget or given away for free, the artist would receive no royalty. The artist can receive up to 3 separate half-a-cent royalty rate increases for album sales above 250,000, 500,000, and 1 million sales. But the only sales that count towards these thresholds are US top-line net sales. So that's how the master royalties were split. What about the expenses? Typically, a record label will front all of the money for expenses. The question then becomes how much of these expenses will count against the label's share of the royalties versus the artist's share. Since this label is getting over 80% of the royalties, it would make sense for that same percentage of the expenses to count against their share. However, that is not what record labels typically do. In this contract, the vast majority of the expenses are recoupable from the artist's share of the royalties. This effectively makes the artist's royalty even smaller. Having a disproportionately high portion of the expenses count against the artist's share enables a record label to potentially make a significant profit even if the artist hasn't fully recouped. There is also an advance, and I'll get to that, but just this structure alone is important. If there were no advance and the artist only ever made 1 album, then the only way the artist would make any master royalties from that album is if they're, at best, 15% master royalty, fully recouped somewhere between 50% to 100% of the expenses. For example, if the label spent $100 on expenses and the artist had to recoup 75% of it, then the label would make that money back when the album generated $100, but the artist wouldn't fully recoup until the album generated at least $500. If the artist bore expenses in proportion to their base royalty, in other words, if the label spent $100 on expenses and the artist had to recoup 15% of it, then the label would still make that money back when the album generated $100, but the artist would also fully recoup at that same point. So one 85-15 royalty split may not be equivalent to another. How the expenses are split can make a big difference in how much money the artist makes. If the album in these 2 scenarios only generated $1,000, then in scenario 1, the artist would receive 15% of $500, and in scenario 2, the artist would receive 15% of $900. If the album only generated $500, then the artist wouldn't receive any money in scenario 1, even though the label made $400. Some record labels may understand that this structure would likely be more scrutinized and not last long if the artist didn't receive at least some master royalties in exchange for the rights they give up. This may be one of the reasons that many record labels also offer artists an advance. For the first album, this label gives the artist a $60,000 advance. This advance is fully recoupable from the artist's share of the royalties. Advances are not loans. In most scenarios, advances and other recoupable expenses do not have to be paid back out of the artist's pocket, even if the music does not generate enough money for the artist to fully recoup. This advance would be considered taxable income for the artist, and they may need to pay a lawyer and manager from it. For each of the next 5 albums, the artist would receive 6-figure advances based on a min-max formula. The albums would all be cross-collateralized, so unrecouped expenses from one album would count against the other albums. So if there are $100,000 in unrecouped expenses for album 1, then even if the artist fully recouped album 2, they would have to also recoup an additional $100,000 to make up for album 1 before they would receive any master royalties for albums 1 or 2. However, even if the artist is unrecouped, a record label may still have made a significant profit, and they would still give the artist the agreed upon advances. There's also a controlled composition clause that pertains to mechanical royalties, a type of publishing royalty. So here's an example of what it may take for this artist to fully recoup album 1 from interactive streams alone. For that album, the artist has a 15% base master royalty. I'll assume they don't produce their own music and give music producers an average of 3 points on the master. The producer's points would come out of the artist's share, leaving them with 12%. For that album, the artist would receive a $60,000 advance that is 100% recoupable, and I'll assume the label spends $40,000 on recording expenses that are 100% recoupable and $100,000 on other expenses such as marketing that average to 75% recoupable. So the label spends $200,000 and $175,000 of it is recoupable from the artist's share of the master royalties. For a 12% master royalty to fully recoup $175,000, the artist's music would have to generate about $1,458,333 in master royalties. Interactive streams pay about half a cent per stream. For US interactive streams, typically around 75 to 82% of that are master royalties and the rest are publishing royalties, which would not help the artist recoup their record deal. So if 78.5% of the streaming payout is a master royalty and 12% of that goes towards the artist's recoupment, then it would take about 371,549,894 interactive streams for the artist to fully recoup from interactive streams alone. At that point, the only master side revenue that the artist would have received would have been the $60,000 advance, minus taxes and potentially lawyers' fees and managers' fees. If the artist also contributed to the writing or production, then they may have also received publishing royalties, though 15 to 50% of those would likely be shared with the music publisher. The music producer would get 3% of about $1,458,333, which is about $43,750. The record label would get the other 97%. It's 85% plus the 12% that would have otherwise gone to the artist. So the label would receive $1,414,583. Subtracting the $200,000 they previously spent would leave about $1,214,583. The label's taxes would depend on the performance of its entire business. So the label could have potentially made a significant profit even if the artist didn't fully recoup. And even if the artist does fully recoup, the label would still own the sound recording copyrights. The advance was likely the artist's primary incentive to give up copyright ownership, but that advance is recoupable from their future royalties. Since all of the potential albums of the record deal are cross-collateralized, then if album 1 doesn't fully recoup, but the label picks up its option for album 2, then album 1's unrecouped balance would also count against album 2. This artist would receive a minimum advance of $250,000 for album 2, but if they don't fully recoup the cross-collateralized amounts, then the only master side revenue they may ever receive would be the advances. Giving advances is a risk for the label, but also for labels seeking the kinds of deals this video describes, deals where the label owns 100% of the sound recording copyrights and receives the vast majority of the master royalties while also counting the vast majority of the expenses against the artist. Such deals would likely be more scrutinized if the label didn't offer an advance. Otherwise, many signed artists may give up a lot of rights and do a lot of work to promote albums, and yet never fully recoup and receive master royalties under this structure, even as the label in many cases potentially made a significant profit. Those kinds of lopsided results could draw a lot of negative PR for a label. So to make an analogy of a much smaller magnitude, it's kind of like someone wanting to start a lemonade stand and buying lemons, sugar, and cups. Yeah, it's a risk, but it's also kind of necessary for the type of business they want to run.